Far uptown in Manhattan, Carl lay sleeping in his bed, tucked in the corner of his small bedroom in his small city apartment. Down below, the sound of a few voices floated up, punctuated by a driver's impatient honking somewhere down the avenue. The sounds wound their way into Carl's sleeping mind, and he found himself floating through the city in a dream. He was somewhere in Midtown, and a thick fog lay over the city. It was nighttime, and lights from buildings twinkled all around him, shining out from the fog. He looked up at the buildings, stretching high into the air, and then glanced around for a street sign, trying to figure out where he was. If he could just find a landmark building, like the Empire State Building, he could figure out where he was in relation to it. Then, he realized that the reason he could not see the iconic point at the top of the Empire State Building was that he was standing directly below it at the building's entrance. Carl decided to take the elevator ride to the 86th floor of the building so he could view the city from the observation deck. In waking life, this would have meant standing in a lengthy line and then waiting in the elevator for the long ride up. But in his dream, Carl somehow found himself immediately on the observation deck. Why was it so uncrowded, he wondered. This was one of the most popular attractions in the city. Looking out, he realized that it was because the city was still shrouded in fog. Great billows of it floated by. The city appeared to be obscured by a fine layer of cotton. And then, with one of the odd shifts of the dream world, the fog was suddenly gone, and the city spread out below him, illuminated into the night by twinkling lights. Carl made his way around the deck, looking out from all angles. There was Central Park, dark and asleep. There was the Brooklyn Bridge, stretching across the East River, connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn. And there was one of the iconic sights of New York City, the Statue of Liberty, standing proudly in New York Harbor, her illuminated torch raised. Carl continued to look at the Statue of Liberty, but now he was no longer observing the city from above. Instead, he was on a boat, looking up. It was the Statue of Liberty ferry, taking him to view the statue and to Ellis Island, where so many immigrants had first set foot in the country. The fog was back, drifting across the water, dampening Carl's face and his hair. The boat sailed in a broad circle around the Statue of Liberty, and Carl gazed at the statue through the otherworldly mist. Then he was still traveling in a circle, but a much smaller one. He was sitting on a painted wooden horse at the carousel in Central Park in daytime. Around and around, he glided atop the horse as calliope music poured out of a mechanical organ, its tinny, old-fashioned notes sounding a cheerful tune. Carl felt calm and happy on the carousel. It seemed he was waving to people watching as he passed them, and they waved back. Once again, the fog had dissipated. The building that the carousel was in was dimly lit, but it had large windows, and the sunlight poured through. Every time Carl's horse passed a window, he rode through a patch of golden light. Then the dream shifted, and Carl was circling still, but this time on the skating rink at Rockefeller Center. It was a crisp winter day, and there were many other people skating alongside him. Everyone was cozily bundled up. Carl wore a thick jacket and a cap, and a long, soft scarf that was wound around his neck and tucked efficiently into his jacket. He had thick, warm mittens. In the dream, he glided swiftly over the ice, even though in real life he was a much more cautious skater. Carl admired the skyscrapers that loomed over the city, keeping his eyes on the changing view as he circled the rink. Now he was at another circle entirely, Columbus Circle, a round street that was the radius for many spokes. Broadway, 8th Avenue, West 59th Street, and Central Park West. Where should we go from here? Once more a mist drifted over the city, and with it, a hush that was not usual for this bustling part of town. Carl decided to follow Broadway down to the theater district. He had always been enthralled by musical theater, the colorful stage lights, the brilliant costumes, the elaborate sets, the swelling music, the staggering talent of the performers. Suddenly, he found himself on stage, participating joyfully in a dance along with several other performers. How did he know the steps? It did not matter how. He moved confidently, his costumes swirling magnificently in unison with the other dancers' costumes. He could hear the audience's applause, but he did not allow himself to be distracted from his work. Two of the other dancers lifted him high into the air, and he stretched his arms out in triumph as the orchestra swelled. Then the dancers set him gently down on the stage, and all of them linked arms and bowed deeply as the audience rose, pounding their palms together and calling for more. But Carl had to move on, the fluid stream of the dream bearing him forward. He was inside a building now, someplace hushed and serious. It was the Museum of Natural History. There was the famous model of a blue whale nearly 100 feet long, suspended from the ceiling. Carl rose up the ceiling to examine the whale up close. Always before, he had looked at it from below, like all the other museum visitors, staring up at his great, rigid underbelly. Now he flew all around it and then over it, admiring the long, sleek model of the sea giant. He imagined what it would be like to see the blue whale swimming, the largest animal on Earth gliding gracefully beneath the waves. As though he were swimming himself, Carl slid out the museum and moved through his dream down 5th Avenue. Though normally the avenue was full of activity, in his dream, it was quiet and relaxed. Shoppers strolled slowly as if they too were in a dream, and the avenue was enveloped in gentle haze. Carl could see the storefronts and the signs, and they shimmered slightly with the mist rippling around them. Double-decker buses filled with tourists rolled down the street, and Carl noticed that the tourists were all comfortably stretched out on the seats, their heads on pillows, napping. He wondered if they too were touring the city in their dreams, and the thought made him smile. After a while, he reached a grand white marble building. The front boasted several columns with 3 large arches between them, and a broad staircase stretching down to the sidewalk. On either side of the staircase, a marble lion sat nobly atop a pedestal. Carl realized with delight that he had reached the main branch of the New York Public Library. He climbed halfway up the marble steps and sat down near the side so that he could watch people as they flowed in and out of the building. He imagined the vast resources that lay within and could almost hear the hum of knowledge, of stories, of the past intertwining with the present and future. The dream lifted him and brought him underground to the subway, and he found himself riding as the train hurled below the city. Though there were free seats, he remained standing, rocking gently back and forth, shifting his weight between his feet to keep his balance, feeling the vibration of the train beneath his shoes. Each time the train came to a halt at a station, he turned his body so that it was aligned with the direction in which the train was moving, leaning his weight in opposition to his body's will to pitch forward. He understood at each stop that it was not yet his time to depart the train, and only after several stops did he understand that he needed to disembark. Rising up from the steps of the subway station, Carl smelled sea air. He had left Manhattan and was now in Brooklyn, in the section called Coney Island. He was right by the Atlantic Ocean, and while it wasn't hot out, it was clearly no longer the winter season it had been at the skating rink. His first stop was at the New York Aquarium. Ever since he'd seen the model of the blue whale at the Museum of Natural History, he had been thinking about the sea, about creatures careening gracefully through water. Here he could view any number of them, and all different types of animals: fish, mammals, reptiles, birds. He strolled past the Sea Cliffs exhibit, where black-footed penguins waddled merrily, climbing rocks and sliding on their stomachs to the pool below. Nearby, harbor seals whipped sleekly through the water, occasionally rolling onto their backs and gliding along as though they were enjoying themselves immensely. Carl entered the aquarium's conservation hall to take in the reef display. It was just like being a diver, except that instead of being immersed in water, he stood completely dry before an enormous glass window that gave him an unobstructed view of the sea life within. He watched the cow-nose rays, flat fish with long fins that turned up at the ends, making them look like bats in flight. He observed the green moray eel, a long, slender marine creature that glowed bright green like a child's glow-in-the-dark toy. As he had been looking at the whale model, he imagined himself swimming like the animals in the ocean. He thought it would be fun to be a marine mammal, like a sea otter, or a sea lion, or a harbor seal. He imagined racing beneath the surface of the sea, gliding effortlessly, surfacing and feeling the sun hit his face. He imagined heaving himself out of the water and onto a sunny rock for a rest, hearing the water lap around him, the seagulls calling in the distance. But the time had come to leave the aquarium, and Carl found himself at the beach nearby, ambling down the boardwalk, the sea stretching all the way to the horizon on his left, the rides of Coney Island visible on his right. He could hear the joyful cries of other visitors. He could smell the scent of the ocean and the sharp, delicious, salty aroma of French fries, and the whiff of something sugary. Cotton candy, he realized. An enormous Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, and Carl could see small children pointed at it excitedly, watching in awe as the wheel began turning, imagining themselves sitting in the cars high in the air. And closer by were the rides perhaps more suitable for the very young, a set of gentle elephants that rose and fell as they slowly spun, a child seated safely in each one, a small carousel of race cars that made a slow, steady loop, each one inhabited by an excited child pretending to drive. Carl walked down a set of stairs that led from the boardwalk to the beach. He kicked off his shoes and pulled off his socks. He turned up the cuff of his pants and walked barefoot through the sand toward the ocean's edge. The sand was fine and white, with a few bits of driftwood that Carl steered carefully past. When he got to the water, a few people were there enjoying the ebb and flow of the surf. Some stood still, shrieking happily when the water rushed in over their ankles, then feeling the sand hollow out beneath their feet when the water pulled back again. Others ran and played, adults and children alike, splashing each other and laughing. Still others knelt on the sand in serious concentration, constructing sandcastles. A child dipped a hand into the very wet sand right at the water's edge and let it dribble down on the very top of a sandcastle, where it set into an elaborate decorative point. Another child walked around with a bucket, collecting small seashells, which she brought over to the child making the castle. The two of them then reached into the bucket and solemnly pressed shells into the outside of the castle, forming a shining border. Carl hoped that the tide would soon not wash away their work. Carl walked for a while along the shore, his feet immersed in the water. At first, he felt the ocean's chill, but after a while, his feet grew used to it, and he enjoyed the way the water felt on top of his feet and the wet sand underneath. He splashed a little as he went along, weaving around other people. Then he moved up onto the shore so that he made wet footprints in the sand just at the shore's edge. He steered a careful half-circle around the remains of someone's castle, though it did not have long enough to last before the incoming tide lapped it away. He felt the cool breeze ruffle his hair and the warm sunshine down on him, warming the top of his head. As he walked, a fog began rolling in off the sea, collecting at the shore, filtering the sun and further cooling the air. Carl could see the fog blow in billows across the sand, a layer of gray that merged the blue of the sky, the golden sun, the gray-green sea, as though an artist had dipped a brush in water and blended together the colors that had not yet dried on the picture. The fog grew thicker, nearly obscuring the view, and then began to dissipate. And when Carl could again see through it, he was no longer walking the shore at Coney Island. His shoes were back on, his pant cuffs turned back down, and he was in another part of the city entirely. He looked curiously at his surroundings, assessing where his dream had brought him, and before he could figure out what he was looking at, he heard the shrill call of a minnow bird. Why was he hearing the sound of tropical birds? Then he realized he was up in the Bronx, at the zoo. The sounds and smells of animals were all around him. He wandered into the bird exhibit, admiring the dazzling plumage and interesting markings that make many of them sported. The minnow was solid white with round, piercing blue eyes. The great blue turaco boasted aqua blue feathers, a fine crown on its head, and a yellow beak with a spot of red at the tip, as though the bird had applied lipstick. Wandering among the birds made Carl think of flight, just as earlier he had thought of swimming. He imagined gliding from tree to tree in a leafy jungle, perching on a high branch and surveying all that happened below. Then he imagined taking off from the branch, spreading his wings wide and soaring high into the air, looking at the land stretched out below. And he no longer imagined a green jungle, but a vast city, New York City, and all that it entailed. From towering buildings to green parks to the very edge of the endless, gleaming ocean. He believed he could hear all of the city's sounds blended together. The roar of traffic, the honking of horns, the chatter of people, the squawks of the animals, the quiet ripple of water against the side of a ferry. His dream brought him to another part of the city entirely. In front of Carl stood a gigantic sphere. He realized it was a globe imprinted with the shape of all the continents. Carl realized that he was in Flushing Meadows, Queens, at Corona Park, the site of the 1964 World's Fair. He was looking at some of the historic remains of the fair. There stood a domed building that had once housed some of the fair's exhibitions, and there were paved avenues running through the park, lined by trees, along which the world had once strolled. People still strolled through the park, walking dogs and pushing baby carriages. They enjoyed the park's facilities, playing tennis and basketball. Carl enjoyed watching the people and thinking about the throngs who had once congregated there to celebrate the progress and achievements of the modern world. And where was he now? He felt a gentle, rhythmic rocking beneath his feet. Was he back on the subway? No, he was on a ferry again. This time it was not the ferry to the Statue of Liberty, but the Staten Island ferry. He stood on the deck with dozens of commuters making their way from the workdays in Manhattan to their homes in the neighborhoods of Staten Island. Once again, Carl enjoyed a view of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island as the boat floated past. He looked back and saw the towering buildings of Lower Manhattan and the bridges that stretched from Manhattan to the city's other boroughs. They faded in the distance as the boat sailed farther from Manhattan. Finally, The ferry stopped at the Staten Island ferry terminal, and Carl walked off the boat with the other passengers. Then, he wasn't on Staten Island after all. Carl's dream deposited him back in his own Manhattan neighborhood. And it was late at night. Most of the windows in the buildings were dark, though a few were lit. And there was never a time that every person in the city was asleep at once, not even in Carl's relatively quiet neighborhood. He found himself walking on the sidewalk. The fog he had experienced intermittently throughout the dream rolled quietly through the streets, not quite obscuring Carl's vision, but softening it around the edges. There was his usual laundromat, closed now for the night. The washers and dryers silent and still. There was the fruit and vegetable market where he regularly purchased his produce. The wares that were displayed outside during the day had been brought in for the night. Carl knew that the owner would be back just as the first light of dawn emerged, pulling up the metal awning, setting up the tables, unloading and stacking brightly colored fruits and vegetables. Carl thought about what he would buy the next time he shopped there. He imagined the produce as a rainbow: plump red tomatoes, orange carrots, bell peppers, green tender leaves of spinach, brown sweet blueberries, a deep purple cabbage that he would shred for a colorful coleslaw. He rounded the corner and passed his favorite diner, which was open all night. The brightly lit windows were tempting in the foggy night. Carl imagined the warmth within, the friendly chat to be had with the waitstaff and the few other patrons, a mug of hot herbal tea warming his hands as he sat at the counter. But the dream bore him on past the diner's doors and over to his favorite bookstore. It was a small shop that specialized in used books, and Carl had spent many hours in there, browsing the stacks, breathing in the comforting smell of old books. The store was dark now, closed for the night, but the cat who kept watch there was awake, curled on a stool, gazing out the window, flicking her tail and taking in Carl with a blaze-eyed glance. Then she closed her eyes and napped, preparing for her long day's work ahead, winding around the ankles of the customers and accepting their affectionate attention. Carl felt sleepy too, if it was possible to feel sleepy while in the middle of a dream. He had, after all, wandered across all 5 of the city's boroughs. The dream brought him back to his own building. He went inside and rode the elevator up to his floor and let himself into his apartment. He changed into his pajamas and got into bed, where, of course, he was already sleeping. The New York dream faded into dreamless slumber, and Carl slept peacefully for the rest of the night. On this note, our story ends. Good night, and sweet dreams.